Welcome back, everybody.
Thank you.
Please fire away. Sorry.
Will do indeed. Hopefully not take too much of your time. I'm here with Ike, who you guys will all know through PC14, and we're here to provide an overview of the recent amendment bill and the draft submission, but we also want to provide an overview of the reforms more generally and what's coming this year. Up on the screen you'll see, or you may be aware, the RM reforms are happening in 3 phases. The first phase was the repeal of the MBE and the SBA. That happened in December 2023. The phase we're in at the moment is phase 2, and that's really focused on targeted changes to the existing RMA system. So the first bill that came through with that was the Fast Track Approvals Bill. That was gazetted end of last year, 2024, and applications for that can be made from the 7th of February. In terms of the other aspects of phase 2, we had the first amendment bill that came through last year that related to fresh water and other matters such as Indigenous biodiversity. That one was enacted October last year. The bill that we'll be discussing today is RM Bill 2, that again focuses on specific changes to the RMA that are there really around implementing the government's priorities. The final phase of phase 2, or the final part of phase 2, is the national direction package. So that will be a raft of changes to existing national direction, and we anticipate that the consultation on that will begin Q1, Q2, so relatively soon. The final phase of reforming the system is phase 3, and that will be the replacement of the RMA. So that will be a substantive change. At the moment, the government has been clear that will focus on the enjoyment of property rights. Is that right? I'll just share. Enjoyment of property rights. And they've signalled that it will come through in 2 bills. So one will focus or have an environmental focus, and the other will focus on urban development and enabling infrastructure. So that's what we've been indicated to date. So there's still a lot to come in terms of the national direction, and that will be of interest to us, and of course the replacement of the RMA. In terms of timeframes for phase 2 and the bill that we'll be discussing today, that's set to receive royal assent mid this year. It's working in conjunction with the timeframes for the national direction as well, which we would again expect around mid-2025. In terms of the bill that the draft submission is on, as I said earlier, that is relating to specific changes to the RMA. It's grouped in 5 broad categories. So the first is housing growth, which incorporates the MDRS optionality, which Ike will touch on later. The next is infrastructure and energy, farming and primary sector, emergencies and natural hazards, and system improvements, which relates specifically to compliance and enforcement, and again, very targeted changes to consenting provisions. I'll hand over to Ike, who's going to give an overview on the Going for Housing Growth program.
So the Going for Housing Growth program runs effectively alongside what the government is intending for the changes that Helena just stepped through for the RM reform. And there are some relationships to what is forthcoming in the Going for Housing Growth program, most notably through the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, NPSUD, which Council recently made a decision on. This first phase, which is highlighted there, is targeted at enabling more housing, but this is part of 3 phases. The second phase is looking at infrastructure funding, which will come later on in the year, and then the third phase is looking at incentives for communities and for councils to support growth as well. So the Going for Housing Growth program introduces the idea of further updating the NPSUD by inserting new housing growth targets, and this will increase the amount of housing growth that should be enabled through any district plan mechanism to 30 years at a high growth scenario rather than at scenario which council feels is appropriate plus the contingency that's there. It also seeks to ensure that the long-term planning or strategic planning for growth is extended from 30 to 50 years, and that's enabling also more greenfield development, removing urban-rural controls as well. And then also, and probably most notably to this council, it's about effectively completely replacing Policy 3. And so that's the part of the MPSUD that Council has most recently made its decision on, Policy 3, which is focused on intensification within and around commercial centres. The replacement of Policy 3 has been indicated to be what the MPSUD originally was, to go back to that, which is effectively focused on accessibility. So accessibility in a broad sense to community services and commercial services alike. Now, of course, naturally, that coalesces around centres anyway, so there isn't a great concern necessarily around that from a centres framework perspective, but it potentially will lead to a wider array of areas that are more intensified rather than just locating around centres as well. And related to that, there's also a focus in the updated MPSUD, which is set to come out later on in the year, for focusing intensification around strategic transport corridors, and the government being specific about which corridors they are and to what degree. The government has expressed some frustration with how councils across the country have done, walking catchments and the many debates around that. And so this is saying, hey, look, we are going to define what the transport corridors are and to what degree the intensification should be and within what catchments as well. In relation to that catchment, the government is also set to focus on enabling mixed-use development within all of those policy areas, as well as all of the urban area. So there's set to be a two-tier approach to mixed use. One is being a medium level of mixed use. So they call it something like metro level supermarkets, or local offices or smaller retail, and that would be enabled across all of that new Policy 3 areas, so within all of those highly accessible areas. And then a lower level of mixed use, effectively what the current district plan does already, would be enabled across the rest of urban areas. It's important to remember that these changes that I'm talking about aren't coming in through the bill which Elaine is talking about, which our submission's focused on, but the bill does talk about the revised NPSUD, which is all of this, which I'll touch upon in a moment. It does also have updates potentially to the Act as well through the Going for Housing Growth Programme. Making MDRS optional is part of this bill, Bill 2, that we are intending to make a submission on, but also which is forthcoming is removing the ability for councils to set requirements or standards around balconies and also around floor area requirements, so minimum floor areas for units and alike. Now, the current district plan has both of those. The balconies element is a product of the MDRS, so government will have to change the direction of that, and the floor area requirements came in through PC14, but were already a feature of the previously existing medium density areas anyway, so there will have to be a change regardless on both of those aspects. So in terms of the relationship to the bill and MDRS optionality, the bill effectively sets up two scenarios for any councils looking to utilise optionality pathways, if you will. Scenario one is where a council has yet to implement fully the MDRS proposal, which is our scenario because we've only done it within and around those commercial centres. We haven't done it in the wider suburbs. And scenario two is where a council wants to remove the MDRS, the 3x3 baseline, if you will, from the existing plan. And there's very different kind of outputs from that. So the bill proposes that in scenario one, where there's an amendment of the proposal of MDRS areas, that from 12 months after the Act comes into force, council can write to the minister and effectively state it's a request to be allowed to withdraw those elements that is yet to be decided on MDRS. Any council like us would need to demonstrate that we have compliance with the existing NPSUD and Policy 3, so intensification within and around those commercial centres, which we've made a decision on, so fundamentally that shouldn't be an issue there. Effectively from there, it would seem that council would simply just withdraw that aspect of the proposal from PC14, similar to what we've recently done for Plan Change 13 for those heritage areas. Scenario 2 is quite different. So scenario 2 would require, whichever way you look at it, a change to the district plan through a process. And so the bill proposes that should a council wish to remove the MDRS baseline, has to go through a streamlined planning process, which is effectively the same as Plan Change 14. Now, that process would in effect be very similar in terms of its scale to Plan Change 14, because alongside that it also requires an assessment of the revised NPSUD, so the updated elements of Policy 3 and also the updates to Greenfield, housing growth targets and alike. And so that would be a fairly substantial plan change process to go through, like I've indicated there. 2 or 3 years, easy to go through a process like that if we wanted to remove those elements that we've already decided on within the plan. If council were to initiate that, it potentially creates this duality in a way where the new REM bill comes in and work is underway to create the new regional plan, which is intended through the new REM bill, alongside giving effect to the new NPSUD. So it's a fairly inefficient process to go through, needless to say. The only other element to point out with scenario 1, in terms of removing those parts of PC14 yet to be decided on, is the 12 months after the Act comes into force. You'll no doubt be aware that Council has until the end of this year to make a decision on the balance of Plan Change 14. And so if we wanted to do an MDRS opt-out, as the bill is currently drafted, we wouldn't be able to do that under the current timeframes that the Gazette notice has set. So fundamentally, if this were to come to pass and no further changes are made to the bill in terms of the 12-month process, Council would likely be requesting a change to the Gazette notice for the Minister for a further 12 months, say for example the end of next year. And so that would give it some time, if it wished, to have the option of going through the MDRS opt-out scenario. Changes the Gazette notice is a fairly straightforward process, but just noting that there's an additional process that Council will need to go through, and that would be at the discretion of the Minister.
In terms of the draft submission itself, we circulated that a couple of weeks ago. The submission itself we've kept relatively high level. It focuses specifically on matters relating to our role as a territorial authority. Staff have prepared a detailed appendix which touches on more technical matters or specific changes to specific clauses that will be attached to the council meeting next week. You would have seen the submission supports many of the proposed amendments, and where we don't agree or do not support the proposed amendments, we've either stated that or sought clarification. So the submission at a glance, I outlined the MDRS optionality. Our submission supports that, but we do have the caveat that it does reference the revised NPSUD, which we haven't been able to see and will be released later this year or early this year. In terms of the proposed SPP process or streamlined process, there are 2 specific changes that we've made to that, mainly around ministerial involvement and direction. Around the delisting and listing of heritage buildings using that process, again, we support in principle that process, but again, similar to above, have requested specific changes. In terms of the changes to natural hazards and emergencies, we again welcome these changes. We have made specific requests in the detailed submission around how we could potentially strengthen some of those provisions. In terms of the compliance and enforcement changes, we're again strongly supportive of those. They are similar, or if not the same, to changes that were proposed through the MBE. around cost recovery, we see that they'll be beneficial to council. And finally, regarding the consenting changes, we support the majority of those. The key one that we do not support is around the hearings and the changes to hearings provisions. In terms of process for finalising the draft submission, the deadline for the submission is 10th of February. We'll be taking it to next week's council meeting on the 5th of February, and we will need to get the submission to meet that deadline signed off today. In terms of next steps for the reforms more generally, we spoke at the start that this will be a big year for RM reform. The first that will come will be this national direction package, which, as Ike has mentioned, particularly the revised NPSUD, will be of great interest to council and what those implications will be. There's also, I've put up there, there's 4 packages that they're proposing for that national direction, probably similar in some way to this bill, but it's infrastructure and energy, housing and urban development, farming and primary sector, and emergencies and natural hazards. So we'll watch those with interest when they come out. As I said, we are anticipating that they could be as early as end of February. The RM bill that we're discussing today will be gazetted mid this year. And then the replacement RM bills are anticipated to be introduced mid this year as well. So again, we'll wait those to see what changes they'll make. And now, any questions or feedback on the submission, we're happy to take.
Okay, thank you. That's good. We've got Sarah and Yanni, please.
Thanks so much. I can't get into the hub, so I can't bring up the specific slide. But when it comes to the things around balconies and floor area, like, fine with removing the requirement for balconies. They're actually often not used, especially at higher levels because it's too windy and those kind of things. Floor areas, I'd rather not get rid of the minimum. I'm happy with having a smaller minimum, if you like, because I think the current one may be a little bit high, but I don't think that getting rid of the minimum is altogether is good. The other thing that's been an issue that's been raised locally as well as nationally recently is the lack of shade for buildings and new residential dwellings reaching sort of 40, 50 degrees in the afternoons, and especially the north-facing ones. So whether it's possible for this to include something in there, if we could just suggest that that's an issue that they take a look at through this, that would be really useful.
Yeah, so I think those changes, Councillor, that you've raised are best placed in our future submission for the NPSUD. So the changes that are for balcony spaces and minimum floor areas aren't part of this bill. They'll be part of the
they're
update.
part of the future one.
Yeah, the
Okay,
updated
right.
NPSUD. And similarly, the changes for heating and the like, either best placed through changes to the building code, or there may be an opportunity through that for the NPSUD changes as well, which may get into more specifics, noting that they're getting into details like balconies and things like that as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Excellent. No more questions? Oh, sorry, Yanni, you did have your hand up.
Where the actual submission is. Like, we've got the PowerPoint, but do we have a copy of the submission?
Yes, it was circulated a couple of weeks. 14 January, thanks.
Cool. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I haven't read it because I wasn't aware that it was there. Apologies. But just trying to understand around that enforcement and compliance, if there's anything that like, can you just give me a summary of kind of what the
key
proposal
changes
is?
Might direct them
Because obviously the concern that has come up with me time and time again is where development actually is non-compliant, and it just seems like that doesn't seem to have any impact on the consideration of the operator going ahead. So generally people get the consent and everything's fine, and I think there was a previous proposal where history of non-compliance could be taken into account.
So that is, again, that's one of the amendments that's proposed. So in terms of consenting history will be taken into account in terms of, is it new consenting? Just looking at Mark. But that has been brought over from the MBE in terms of the history of someone's, yeah. Is that correct, Mark?
Increasing penalties as well.
Yeah, increasing penalties, cost recovery.
Yeah, there were so a number of changes that were introduced by the previous Natural and Built Environment Act under the previous government have been incorporated into this amendment bill, given the Natural and Built Environment Act got revoked. And those seek to improve the ability of councils to manage compliance and enforcement. In terms of details, I'll send you and other councillors a summary of that.
But just in terms of our submission, like if someone's repeatedly being
Offending,
non-compliant, do we have the ability to rescind the consent?
I'll check the rescinding of the consent. You can definitely consider their compliance history when issuing new consents, but
Yeah.
I'll check the rescinding of the consent.
And a
for
new
you.
consent would include a consent variation?
Certainly under we can review conditions of a consent at the moment. One of the matters introduced, I understand, is to enable consideration of compliance history when we review a consent. So we can review an existing consent in terms of conditions. Whether we can rescind the consent entirely, I'll have to come back to you.
And is there anything in there about in the infrastructure section around things like port activities? Like is it enabling more infrastructure to be built easier, regardless of the environmental effects or the impacts on local communities? Is that basically the thrust of this bill?
Not necessarily directly in relation to port. There is a port. There is changes in terms of the provisions regarding that.
Right.
But in terms of the infrastructure and energy, it's largely relating to providing infrastructure providers or energy providers with greater certainty. So for the likes of infrastructure, for designations, previously it was 5 years, they've upped that to 10 years, and also the duration of energy consents as well. That's also been a change, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, increased to 35 years.
But I just wonder whether, given that Councillor Johansson hasn't had an opportunity to read it, if he reads it and then he's got comments, he could
Come see
email
it.
or come to see you, can't you? Yeah.
But I
So
think
if you we'll send it out
that
to
would be
you.
helpful. But at a high level, I think we should be raising the frustration that the community has with auditory characteristics of development. Like there needs to be some greater controls around powers that we have.
Okay, thank you.
If that was possible.
And
that would be
lastly, Tyler.
Great. Really quick ones. In short, just for public knowledge in layman's terms, can we just quickly just brush over what the implications for PC14 is in terms of the MPSUD and MDRS and what's going to happen moving forward?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, it depends on what council wishes to do, in a nutshell. But fundamentally, in terms of changes that are forthcoming to the NPSUD, if council is satisfied enough to simply withdraw the elements that have yet to be decided on the NPSUD, in terms of PC14, then there's no need to give effect to the NPSUD. It simply will be given effect to any rolling review or updates to the RM reform, which I believe will feed that in as well. So as long as council is satisfied enough to simply withdraw those elements of PC14 that is yet to be decided on in suburban areas, then there's no need to consider the revised NPSUD.
Great.
It's only if we seek to modify what we've already decided on, what we decided in December last year, that's when the NPSUD will come in, and that's when we will enter into a multi-year process similar to PC14 all over again.
Great. And you brushed over the transport corridors and that it was government directed from now on. Have they set those yet?
They have not, no. So I would expect that to come out when they formally release the draft MPSUD for submissions.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, and back, please.
Thank you. Just then to clarify, following up from Councillor Harrison Hunt, when do we as a council decide what route we're going to take? When is it coming before us?
Well, there are some milestones, obviously, that council will need to consider. So by the end of this year, at the current Gazette notice, we will need to consider the balance of Plan Change 14. So all things being unchanged, we'll need to make that consideration by the end of this year. What we've noted in the submission to the bill is that there's a 12-month period after the bill comes into effect, and after that 12-month period, then a council can choose to approach the minister to do an MDRS opt-out. So if council wishes to proceed with doing an MDRS opt-out for the balance of PC14, Then the next step would be for council to seek an amendment to the Gazette notice, which dictates the time frame for making a decision on the balance of PC 14.
So I understand that. To clarify then, when does it come back before us, to us? When are you seeking our input and what is that pathway?
Yeah, good question. I think that depends on, firstly, how the bill is finalised in terms of the Act. That is also subject to change, and also where the MPSUD lands as well. So we are anticipating that within the next 8 weeks or so that the updated MPSUD is released, and we'll obviously draft a submission for that as well. So once we know with finality what our options are, then we'll be coming back at some point with that. So
That was the answer I was looking for. Thank you.
And lastly, Aaron.
Yeah, it's not directly related to this, but it affects this quite a lot, is the airport noise contour. Why is that not lining up and being done prior to all the other things lining up and being done? And does it become counterproductive if it's not done in time? Because that's like thousands of sections potentially.
So the airport noise contour is defined in both our district plan and the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement. The proposed Canterbury Regional Policy Statement was to be notified in December. ECAN made a decision to defer that.
December which year?
Oh, it was going to be December.
It was a couple of years ago, and then it got pushed and pushed.
December 2024. That got deferred in light of new legislation that precluded the councils from notifying a freshwater planning instrument. Time will tell of what ECAN.
How does the noise affect the freshwater?
So the Canterbury RPS has the airport noise contours in it, but it's also got freshwater planning provisions within it, and so ECAN made a decision to defer the whole of the document to a future date for notification. That affects the timing of the review of the airport noise contours.
And they can't be pulled apart?
No, they considered that option but discounted it and went with an option of deferring it.
They set a date?
I mean, not yet, but in terms of greenfield land, we'll come back to you with a briefing on options for greenfield opportunities in the interim, even with the current RPS in place. There is a pathway under the MPS-UD and potentially under the revised MPS, but perhaps we'll brief you on that more fully once we've seen the MPS.
So, Mr. Mayor, given that we had a legal threat from quite an organised community a number of years ago, can we write to ECAN and say, look, we need a date on that, and it affects us, we own the airport as well. It's just unacceptable that they're dragging the chain that much on that particular item. All their other stuff, great, no worries, but that one, we have to get sorted because that legal threat was very serious, unless we call them and say, action it, get going.
Aaron, that's not a question for Phil. He's conflicted, so it may need to go to Mary.
I am, yeah.
Okay, well, I threw the mayor.
Yeah, of course.
They might tell us to the same MDRS, stop dragging the chain, so they could.
Yeah, fair
All right. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. That's brilliant.
thank you.
So that ends the lesson. So thank you, Ike and Helena, and Mark, of course, and that concludes the information session for today. Thank you very much.